As a library user, I have witnessed many changes in library services, particularly as more content has gone digital and become accessible on the internet. I first heard about institutional repositories during my first semester as a student in the Library and Information Science program at Wayne State University. I became curious as to what they are and how they are managed. I am Judith Pasek, and I want to share with you some of what I have learned about institutional repositories from having read some of the literature published on this topic. I will be covering what institutional repositories are, their purposes, functions, and management, as well as a number of issues that librarians have been dealing with while attempting to establish and manage their institutional repositories. The institutional repository may be difficult to find on your particular library's website. Some libraries include an institutional repository as an option in their catalog, and that may be the first place that you find it. However, many other institutional repositories are buried under 3 or 4 pages away from the home page and can be more difficult to identify as they go by various names. For example, they may be called a digital repository, which is actually a broader term than an institutional repository. Wayne State University uses digital commons. Cornell calls them e-commons. And although many of the larger research universities have their own institutional repositories, some schools have combined in consortial arrangements to offer the materials. This is a practical option for many smaller colleges that don't have the resources and funding to be able to sponsor their own institutional repository. Institutional repositories can be defined in a variety of ways. These variations may reflect the differing purposes for which institutions develop their repositories. There are 4 common elements within these definitions. The first is that it is an institution-wide service. This differentiates it from subject repositories or digital collections that may be for special collections. With an institution-wide service, the material reflects what the institution creates, and faculty throughout the institution can make their work available through this service. It also is a collection specifically of scholarly works, so it does not include, for example, minutes of faculty meetings or some other types of documents that occur during the normal course of business at a university or college. The material is also limited to digital content. It may be born digital materials that are created and disseminated in a digital format, or it could include digitized materials as well. The 4th criterion for defining institutional repositories is that it accepts submissions from institution members, usually through self-archiving interfaces. We will talk more about self-archiving in a little bit. So what are the key features and functions of institutional repositories? Gibbons describes 5 general categories of features that are typical of institutional repositories. They clearly need to have digital content, and as that is the format in which the material is stored and disseminated. It is community-driven and focused, in that it is a showcase for the scholarship of the organization, and content is generally sponsored or provided by community members. It is institutionally supported, as institutional repositories are quite expensive to run and manage, and long-term funding is needed to assure continuity of the content. It is expected to be a permanent and durable location for holding scholarly works. This may be in the form of a permanent URL and may also include services for migrating formats over time. It is also accessible content in that it is made available online via search engines and through internet dissemination to public audiences. Seaman used a slightly different means of describing the features and functions, suggesting that institutional repositories are for collecting, that is, gathering together works, publishing, being a place for content, preserving and promoting the content of the institution, and for repurposing, in that content can be reused for teaching and research purposes. The key operations of institutional repositories are dependent on functionalities of the software. They generally include an electronic means of submitting material, either by the author or an author's proxy. They also allow for upload or entry of metadata, such as title, authors, subject terms, keywords, and other descriptive information that can be helpful for retrieval. The systems also have access controls so that only authorized contributors are able to put materials into the system. Software also includes a discovery support tool. Metadata or full-text content can be searched using the Open Archives Initiative protocol for metadata harvesting. This allows general search engines to index the content so that it can be found on the internet. This software also requires a means for distribution, which is a mechanism for the user to access and view the material, and maybe even download and print it to their own PC. Backup services are also provided, as well as oftentimes document migration from one format to another. Many purposes have been identified for institutional repositories. Not all institutions use the same purposes. They may be a combination of purposes that are on this list, or there may be others that are not on this list. But this list provides a general idea of the intent of offering institutional repositories to the community of users. Deciding on a strategy can be one of the more difficult aspects of setting up an institutional repository, because institutional repositories cannot be all things to all users. There need to be decisions made about what type of content, how much content, and what formats might be supported. If the collections are going to have a large number of items, it is going to be difficult to have thorough metadata due to the resources necessary to carry that out. With fewer items, more metadata can be provided. The degree to which the organization and librarians support preservation also will determine how that repository shapes itself. Even though most institutional repositories are designed primarily for open access, there may be certain materials that need to have closed access. They may be available to only a few people initially, such as a research group that is working with data that has not yet been finalized. Many different content types may be suitable for inclusion in institutional repositories. Each institution needs to develop its own policies as to what it deems to be appropriate materials. Most institutional repositories were established with an idea that they would be a place to provide more open access to published journal articles. However, faculty have been slow to take up this type of deposit activity. Copyright permissions can be difficult to negotiate to actually post this material in an institutional repository. Content can also vary from full-text articles to abstracts and metadata only. So this is an area where additional policy needs to be established. The more full content that is available, the more useful the repository becomes to the users. The institutional repository is an ideal location for so-called gray literature. It can be a place to publish materials that are not accepted in other formats or that are more informal in nature, such as conference proceedings. Accepting the non-traditional types of publications can generate interest among faculty, which then may result in more recruitment of journal articles as well. More funding agencies are beginning to mandate that researchers make their data sets available, so this is also a growing use for institutional repositories. Smaller colleges in particular like to use institutional repositories for teaching content as well as any research content. Many institutional repositories turn to collecting student theses and dissertations as a way to fill their repositories with content when faculty deposits didn't materialize as anticipated. In fact, dissertations are some of the most frequently downloaded materials from institutional repositories when they are provided in an open access format. Original publication has not been a big contributor to institutional repository content. I expect this is a disappointment to those who promote an open access scholarly publication model. However, there are some successes. For example, the University of Nebraska Institutional Repository published an online dictionary of invertebrate zoology, which has become their most commonly downloaded content. Some institutional repositories also allow content by authors who are not employed by the institution, as long as there is some sort of association, such as commencement speeches or guest lectures. Administrative material may be collected to provide historical records of the institution, or could be used for promoting the institution and fundraising activities, as well as student recruitment. The most successful repositories generally have a very wide diversity of collection types. 45% of faculty agree that they should be able to deposit any type of content. Most institutional repositories have been underfunded and understaffed, and therefore have not been able to deliver a full array of support services that are necessary to growing content. This is a very important area to consider when setting up a new institutional repository and for managing institutional repositories on a continuing basis. Providing user statistics on a monthly basis to faculty can also help support recruitment of additional content, as faculty can get excited when they see how their publications are being used and accessed. Librarians need to decide how involved they want to be in overseeing the content of institutional repositories. Much of the content may be outside of the areas of reviews and collection development tools that librarians have typically relied upon. However, by allowing anything to be deposited, this can result in a chaotic collection with a wide range of quality and may in fact reduce the usefulness of the material. However, limiting deposits to only refereed journal articles that have already been published elsewhere will doom an institutional repository to failure. One study found that the highest impact research journals are not finding their way into institutional repositories. Even when faculty submit materials, it may include badly scanned files, overly large files, or missing metadata that is important for search engine functionality. Providing library assistance can help to alleviate many of these shortfalls. Many challenges and obstacles have been identified in relation to establishing institutional repositories. Many of these are interrelated. Cost is a big factor because of the expense of not only the infrastructure to house the material, but also the staff to manage and run institutional repositories. Recruitment of content from faculty has been disappointing for a number of reasons that we will cover shortly. This leads to a number of issues that librarians need to address in recruiting materials and solving problems. These issues include copyright permissions, preservation of materials, technical difficulties, and promotional and marketing obstacles to making institutional repositories understood by potential contributors and users. Institutional repositories are a relatively new service provided by many academic libraries. They began to develop in the early 2000s with the release of several different software systems. Around this same time, the open access movement became a prominent discussion topic amongst librarians. Many library directors anticipated that the creation of institutional repositories would be a solution to the scholarly communication crisis, which resulted from the escalating prices of journal subscriptions. Many institutional repositories were quickly developed with the expectation that faculty would be willing to deposit their publications in the systems and grow the content. However, content recruitment has remained very slow. A period of disillusionment set in, where librarians needed to look at the reasons why faculty were not really interested in contributing content. Many of the libraries then had to realign their priorities, reassess their policies and programs and support for the system, and perhaps move them in a different direction. There still is a lot of promise for the applicability of institutional repositories, although there are a number of challenges to making it fully successful. One of the inhibitors to having more successful institutional repositories going forward is a lack of interoperability between the various software packages. It is very difficult to migrate content from one system to another. The choice of software package is very important when beginning the process of establishing an institutional repository. The systems don't talk to each other, and so the institutional repositories tend to stand on their own little islands. The development of links between these various repositories is a process that is really needed for the future. The evolution of institutional repository development can be seen as having progressed through 4 different models, none of which is entirely satisfactory. Initially, many of the early adopters took the attitude of the field of dreams. If you build it, they will come. They expected faculty to be very excited about contributing to institutional repositories. This turned out to not be the case. Next, many librarians tried to promote institutional repositories to make it look like it was something very fun and attractive for faculty to join. This approach also was very short-lived. Several institutions have created mandates for their faculty, requiring them to deposit their refereed publications into their institutional repositories. This is in reaction to the very slow content recruitment rates made on a voluntary basis. More recently, there is recognition that faculty really don't want to self-archive their material. They do not want to take time away from their research activities to be doing essentially what they consider to be clerical work. Providing services has become the greatest factor in recruiting content. Providing technical support, navigating the various copyright problems, providing preservation services, converting format types, adding metadata to make the content more searchable, and other forms of assistance as needed. Many librarians were so enamored of the idea of an institutional repository, expecting it to be widely accepted with very little effort, that they did not conduct a user needs assessment before proceeding. This is unusual for libraries. Almost every program that a library begins starts with some type of needs assessment. In this case, the needs assessment really needed to look at not only the types of documents that might be included, but also what the users wanted, what types of support they needed, and the resources necessary to make the systems work and be successful. Many of the early adopters of institutional repositories did not do the background work and study that they really needed. Institutions that have tried to develop institutional repositories more recently have been smarter in doing that necessary needs assessment and have been more successful in implementing their systems. A look at what content is already deposited into institutional repositories in the United States found that only a little more than a third of the content has been authored by faculty. More content has been recruited from student work than from faculty. The largest universities for institutional repositories are contributing the most of that faculty content. If you eliminate the top 5 schools for amount of institutional repository content, the percentage that faculty contribute drops significantly. Those 5 institutions have done a lot more work in gaining acceptance of their institutional repositories by their faculty members. The self-archiving functionality was modeled after successful disciplinary repositories that began in the 1990s and used this method to recruit content. It was a real surprise to many institutional repository managers when faculty did not immediately jump on the deposit bandwagon. A large percentage of authors have deposited only one item, and this may be a reflection of the heavy concentration of content based upon recruitment from student dissertations. Mandatory deposits were instituted at a small number of prestigious universities in an attempt to remedy the disinterest by faculty. These mandatory policies have been effective in increasing the number of articles deposited by any given faculty member. However, in most instances, mandatory deposits are not enforceable. It turns out that there are many reasons why faculty are not enamored of depositing materials into institutional repositories. Chief among them is that they are just too busy trying to produce research output to worry about archiving the content. There's also a lot of confusion about copyright permissions. It can be safer to not deposit something rather than potentially violate a copyright condition. There are also concerns about intellectual property, confidentiality, and plagiarism of freely accessible content. If the content has not gone through a peer review process already, faculty could potentially be publishing erroneous information that would then damage their reputation. Control of content is also a big issue. Faculty want to be able to decide how material is displayed, when it is displayed, and who can access it. By including their material into an institutional repository, they have much less control over how that content appears compared to publishing it on their own website. The software tools for modifying content that has been deposited are very poor. Faculty also are concerned that if they publish something or make information available in a repository, that it will then not be suitable or acceptable for traditional publication. All of these concerns also feed into concerns over tenure and promotion. The youngest faculty, generally assistant professors, are less likely to contribute content to an institutional repository compared to tenured faculty. Even though the intent of an institutional repository is to make content more widely available through open source mechanisms, many faculty do not think people in their discipline go to such repositories to look for content or articles. Faculty may also be concerned about the mixture of low-quality materials with peer-reviewed materials. They also distrust libraries to be able to provide long-term digital preservation of their content. Early efforts to encourage the use of institutional repositories by faculty failed largely because benefits were promoted that applied primarily to institutions and libraries rather than to individual faculty members. Faculty want to have their publications visible to enhance their stature and available within their disciplines more so than as a collection within the institution that employs them. The benefits of institutional repositories are generally not perceived by faculty to be useful. Those services that faculty want are not offered by institutional repositories. Faculty want improved workflows for creating publications and grant proposals, and they want mechanisms to facilitate peer review and receive feedback from their colleagues. The Web 2.0 technologies have not yet been integrated well into institutional repository software. Institutional repositories really do not help faculty with their primary functions, which can lead to tenure and promotion. Therefore, institutional repositories were seen as something nice to do, but not necessarily something that faculty wanted to spend their time on. Initially, institutional repository managers assumed that low article deposit rates were due to a lack of awareness and understanding of them by faculty. Surveys found that only 40 to 60% of faculty were aware of their institutional repositories. Institutional repository managers tried to reframe their messages to faculty about the benefits of institutional repositories in terms that faculty would appreciate. They hoped that this would gain greater participation and content recruitment. However, these messages for faculty really did not change their behavior. Although faculty acknowledged that institutional repositories were good things, they still did not want to become active self-archivers. Studies were then initiated to find out what faculty wanted. Faculty who do self-archive are primarily motivated by a desire for greater dissemination of their works. Continuing contributions are reinforced by a desire for long-term preservation and by getting usage statistics about their contributions. The study of faculty needs resulted in new features being developed to serve as a way to highlight individual faculty work and make the management of their deposits easier for them. These customized add-ons, however, were not widely shared between different institutions and became inoperable as new releases of the institutional repositories software were rolled out. This discouraged further innovation in institutional repository software design. Faculty still did not want to spend time depositing their own materials. The most successful institutional repositories have resulted from the deposit of articles by someone other than the authors. This is often a librarian who assists the author in the process, but it can also involve administrative assistants who are part of the department where a faculty member resides. This brings us back again to the necessity of providing service in support of institutional repositories. Librarians can be involved in many aspects of the development and management of institutional repositories, and especially in its promotion, recruitment of content, and assistance with copyright issues, metadata support, and preservation options. Consultation services for data management is going to be a huge growth area, in my opinion, over the next few years as well. Recruitment of content needs to be active, not passive. As librarians, we can't just wait for faculty to offer up their content. Librarians need to seek out content from faculty, their vitas, and annual reports that list research publications, and offer to assist with loading that content. In addition, they can seek out special collections or special projects that are suitable for inclusion in institutional repositories. Support for institutional repositories has surprisingly been slow to catch on with librarians as well as with faculty. Many librarians do not see management of the institutional repository as being part of their duties. Furthermore, much of the institutional repository content does not fit into traditional collection development activities, and so it is unfamiliar to many librarians. Adding institutional repository responsibilities onto existing library duties has not worked very well. Designating one or two librarians as being in charge of managing the institutional repository projects also has suffered from a lack of adequate support. A cooperative model with buy-in throughout the organization is needed to move forward with more successful institutional repository projects. Outreach and promotion also needs to be directed towards librarians and not just to faculty and administrative officers. The issue of securing copyright permissions is probably an entire topic unto itself. I will cover it only briefly. It was surprising to me to find that 40% of institutional repositories do not seek permission from copyright holders apart from the direct repository contributors. This is a huge lack that will hinder the ability to migrate materials to new formats to preserve them over time. More than 60% of copyright clearance activities of institutional repositories are now conducted by library staff. 98% of institutional repositories that were surveyed in the United States consulted the Sherpa Romeo online directories for publisher copyright information. But over half of these institutional repositories reported that there are information gaps. 88% reported that they needed to contact publishers directly to obtain permissions for institutional repository deposits. These contacts are often made on an individual article basis. Only about a third of institutional repositories try to obtain blanket permissions. This is a significant area where additional development is needed to advance the usefulness of institutional repositories. One of the greatest challenges, cited by 74% of survey respondents, was educating authors about copyright. The next highest challenge, at 61%, was obtaining copyright policies from publishers who are often very slow to respond, or publishers might not have information stated within their policies as to how to address repositories. Often agreements need to be renegotiated before materials can be deposited into an institutional repository. Although preservation has been pushed as one of the biggest advantages for using an institutional repository, less than half of the institutional repositories have actually developed plans for long-term preservation involving content migration with changes in technology. Preservation has generally not caught on with faculty as the reason to deposit their works. This is more of a concern to librarians. But even librarians are not making regular deposits of their own scholarly publications. So pushing preservation as a benefit can sound hypocritical to faculty. Even more distressing is that many faculty do not trust librarians to be able to provide that preservation service, or they do not expect adequate funding and staffing to be present to deal with long-term preservation through the institutional repositories. So this is another area where issues need to be addressed in order for institutional repositories to be successful into the future. Institutional repositories have been developed essentially under two opposing philosophies or approaches. Early adopters in particular saw institutional repositories as competition for traditional publishing and a possible answer to the scholarly communications crisis. Later adopters tended to look more towards institutional repositories as a supplement to traditional publishing. It was a means for storing and distributing scholarly information that might not be attractive to commercial publishers because it had a limited audience, or it would be unprofitable for some other reasons, or was not in alignment with the types of content that the publisher sponsored. Many missteps were made during the course of development of institutional repositories. First, institutional repository software and services that were offered were not of value to faculty. Marketing efforts were futile as benefits were not presented in a manner that appealed to faculty. Many institutional repositories then decided to accept all sorts of content to justify their expenses. This may have led to a perception of low quality of content. Few institutional repositories offered mediated deposit services, and self-service was found to not be a workable model. Institutional repositories were generally understaffed, poorly supported, and often misunderstood. Software architecture of the institutional repositories is largely inflexible and not designed with the user in mind. This is another area that certainly requires more development for institutional repositories to become more successful. Librarians tend to see institutional repositories in terms of access, scholarly communication, and institutional promotion, whereas faculty think more in terms of storage, services, and marketing of themselves. In order for institutional repositories to be successful, these differing viewpoints need to be reconciled. A number of ideas have been offered for strengthening institutional repository efforts. Each library will need to consider what approaches might work best for them. For example, a number of authors have argued that mandatory deposit policies are necessary, but this approach is controversial. Marketing and outreach would still be necessary, and enforcement is impossible. Although deposit rates have increased substantially where mandatory deposit policies have been implemented by some prestigious institutions, strong-arming faculty members does not sound like the best approach to this MLIS student. About 3/4 of faculty oppose mandatory deposit policies. In summary, the future success of institutional repositories will depend not only on the ability to recruit content from faculty, but also on improving processes to make them as easy as possible. There is a need to streamline the process of copyright permissions through better initial agreements, blanket agreements with publishers, development of documentation and tracking systems, and sharing information between institutional repositories. There is also a need to automate the process of uploading articles from publishers. Resolution of copyright issues and automated uploads will require overcoming resistance from commercial publishers. Better long-term preservation policies and business plans are also needed to increase confidence in institutional repository services. Open access publishing and self-publishing by faculty has not yet caught on as hoped. However, as tenure policies and faculty attitudes evolve, institutional repositories will be ready and able to handle these functions. Economics will likely play a role as commercial publication costs continue to escalate. Also, the continued desire of users to have freely available access to content over the internet may entice more faculty to archive their works in institutional repositories. As of January 2011, the National Science Foundation has mandated that all grant proposals must be accompanied by a data management plan that describes how research data will be disseminated and preserved. This is likely to result in higher demand for data curation services, which can be met through design of institutional repository services. Academic libraries have been a bit ahead of user needs in the development of institutional repositories. However, time was needed to begin to refine the applications, policies, and procedures so that a quality service can be at the ready. Institutional repository managers in general remain optimistic about the evolution of institutional repositories despite the numerous challenges over the past few years. To this MLIS student, institutional repositories appear to be an exciting area of academic library development and hold a lot of promise, although perhaps not as originally envisioned by the early adopters. I look forward to working in an ever-growing, changing, and challenging digital environment. Hundreds of articles have been published on the topic of institutional repositories over the past 10 years, as institutional repositories have gone through various development stages. One of the best examinations of the difficulties of establishing and managing institutional repositories was published by Dorothea Salo in 2008. The article appeared in Library Trends entitled Innkeeper at the Roach Motel. Data goes in, but it doesn't come out. Salo compiled a list of 12 recommendations based upon her experience for what must happen next for institutional repositories to be successful. If you have time to read only one article on the topic of institutional repositories, make sure you look at Salo's work. Thank you for watching.